I've been asked to volunteer to pick up tickets for friends. I was waiting for them to be with but that's right. Yeah. It's up to you. I was have to do that earlier. Okay. Yeah. I'll check what Good afternoon. For those of you who are joining us online, the program will start shortly. While you're looking at the screen, if you can please locate the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, that will enable you to type in questions throughout today's program. Again, welcome, and we'll be starting the program shortly. Yes, you had two opportunities to see how it all in months and then here's some. Well, we've got this one history campus. That's the last time You didn't get it. Yeah. Good afternoon. For those of you joining us online, we'll be starting the program shortly. Please locate the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Throughout the program, you can type in your questions at that icon. Thanks. We'll be with you shortly. Good.
No, I'm good. Yeah. I mean, so sounds like I am just oh yeah. I know. No, I didn't know. I didn't know. Maybe it was making a regards. Probably the yeah, I know. That's okay.
Good afternoon. For those of you who are joining on Zoom, we'll be beginning in about 2 minutes. Please locate the Q&A icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and that will enable you to type in questions throughout today's program. Thanks for attending.
And every topic gets amazing. Widespread information as well. Right. I mean, yeah, I
So says the clock. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. And to those of you in our online audience, of which there are many, thank you. We were competing with the weather today, and we are so grateful for all of you who are inclined historically to spend the afternoon with us. My name is Deirdre Anderson. I serve as the Executive Director of the Hingham Historical Society, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to our 2024-2025 lecture series, Revisiting the American Revolution. A few programming notes before we start today's program. This Thursday and Friday, we welcome 300 11th graders, the class of 2026, Hingham High School's semi-quincentennial class, to our properties to kick off their year-long study of American history with a field trip to this museum and Hingham's National Historic Landmarks, the Old Ship Meeting House and the Benjamin Lincoln House. Staff would benefit from 3 to 4 volunteer hosts for each of our properties, 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. on Thursday or Friday, as we welcome students and direct them to stations. If you are interested in volunteering and want some good evidence that the future is bright, please let Victoria McCallion, our new museum educator, know. Victoria, please give a wave. On Sunday, September 9th, from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m., is the Society's annual pilgrimage to historic homes. In keeping with our Rev 250 theme, this year's tour features 6 private homes once occupied by American Revolutionary War patriots, and 5 public buildings, including our own loyalist holdout, the Old Ordinary. If you have never experienced a house tour, these are self-paced opportunities to visit Hingham's incredible historic assets. Spend as little or as long as you'd like visiting the properties. We also could use some volunteers. It takes about 100 people to staff the historic house tour. And if you want any evidence that Hingham is an incredible, in fact, we rival Ipswich in the nation for the number of preserved 17th and 18th century homes. So if you want to feel good about what we offer the world, we welcome you to volunteer. And please see Gail Litchfield. Gail, can you give a wave? Our incredible volunteer coordinator, if you're interested in one of 2 3-hour shifts. Sunday, September 29th. September 29th. 2 weeks from today. Tickets are on sale now, and this is a tour you do not want to miss, especially for a chance to be inside the cover model of this year's tour, the Cushing Homestead. So with those programming notes aside, it is now my pleasure to introduce to you Society board member and chair of the Society's commemoration, Rev 250, America's 250th Committee, Gordon Carr, to talk a bit about our commemoration plans and to introduce you to today's speaker. Gordon.
Thank you, Deirdre. Great to be with you. What a crowd on a day like this. This is really terrific. So thank you so much for all of you for being here. And as Deirdre said, I'm chairing the Rev 250 committee for the Historical Society. We've got a lot of great things planned for the coming years. By commemorating the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution through America's 250th, we're offered a tremendous opportunity to reintroduce our history to our community and to build stronger foundations of shared historical understanding. At the Hingham Historical Society, we believe deeply that increased historical literacy strengthens our democracy, and we're proud to lead Hingham's commemoration planning. Many of you have already supported the Society's commemorative events, including the December 16th Boston event, celebrating the anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, and a wonderful program we had in early February with Susan Wetzel and Ellen Miller on the American Revolutionary War Patriots from Hingham. If you missed that back then, we have a reprise on Tuesday evening at Hingham Public Library, 7 p.m., Ellen? Great. So if you missed that, try to make it. It really is an extraordinary tale of what Hingham's history has been and the role that we played in the American Revolution. In the last month, the Hingham Historical Society was awarded a challenge grant of $230,000 by the Massachusetts Office of Travel and Tourism to help prepare our museums for the commemorative years. This level of investment in Hingham is a testament to our rich history and to the state's belief in our ability as a community to welcome the world and share American history. On Tuesday, Deirdre and I will be joining Governor Healy on the steps of the Massachusetts State House to officially launch Mass 250th. In the months ahead, we will ask for your support to match our Massachusetts 250 grant and continue to support our commemorative efforts. You'll hear more as we go forward in the coming months about what we have planned for 2025 and then, of course, 2026. So today feels very much like this sort of kickoff of all of that. This is the inaugural lecture for their lecture series. And then, as Deirdre said, with the house tour coming up in 2 weeks, we'll be off and running. No better way, I don't think, to kick that off than with our first lecture guest, Mary Beth Norton. Mary Beth is the Mary Donlon Alger Professor of American History Emerita at Cornell University, where she taught from 1971 to 2018. She has written 7 books about early American history, including Liberty's Daughters, The Revolution Experience of American Women, The Devil's Snare, Salem Witchcraft Crisis of 1692, which I have not read, but must now, based on what I learned about it. And she was the author, with others, of A People and a Nation, which has appeared in its 11th edition in 2018 and is one of the leading U.S. history textbooks since its initial publication in 1982. So in many ways, literally wrote the book on American history. Her most recent work is 1774, The Long Year of Revolution, published by Alfred A. Knopf in February 2020. It's the subject of her talk today. I haven't read it yet, but it is all about the roil and churn and everything that happened in the years leading up to when we all started to pay attention to the story about the American Revolution. It's exhaustively researched and detailed. I understand that not only will the book tell you exactly how much tea was on all of the vessels in Boston Harbor, but how many chests of each of the 5 different types of tea there were. So you will get a full picture. I can't wait to hear the remarks today. Mary Beth, her book won the 2021 George Washington Prize as the best book of the American Revolution, published the preceding year. She has been elected a member of both the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. Mary Beth served as president of the 12,000-member American Historical Association in 2018. She splits her time between Ithaca, New York, and West Tisbury, Massachusetts, where Deirdre told me that last night they learned that due to the high density of authors in West Tisbury, it is called the Athens of Martha's Vineyard. I think it's the Athens of Massachusetts at that point then. Welcome, Professor Norton. We look forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's very nice to see everybody here. I'm glad you came in from the hot, beautiful sun to hear about the American Revolution. I'm going to take a little sip of water first. But people in West Tisbury will appreciate the comments. We call ourselves the Athens of the Vineyard. I think pretty much everybody does, but alas, we lost one of our authors recently, and that's David McCullough. Okay, this year is, as you've heard, the 250th anniversary of the events leading up to the revolution and the start of a word you heard from Deirdre, the semi-quincentennial, a term we all have to learn to say. I have to say it was a lot easier when it was the bicentennial in 1976. I've been asked to speak during 2024 in a variety of places, including here, because, as you know, my most recent book is indeed entitled 1774, The Long Year of Revolution. I can't claim to have planned ahead for this anniversary the way some historians are known to do. I know there are historians who look ahead and say, 5 years from now or 10 years from now, there's going to be this anniversary, so I'll be able to sell books about whatever my topic is. But I didn't think that way. I began the research for this book in 2009 purely because of happenstance. I was in residence at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, and had completed the first draft of the book. I'd been writing there while I was on leave for a year from teaching at Cornell. I've never been able to write a book without being on leave. Having finished versions of all the chapters, I wanted to reread the entire book manuscript before tackling the conclusion and the introduction, both of which always have to be written last, because you don't know what you're introducing or what you're concluding until you've written it. I had to teach my graduate students that. I needed both time and distance from the book manuscript I had been preparing for many months to think about how to introduce and to conclude it. So, to make good use of my retaining time at the Huntington, I knew that the library had pamphlets and manuscripts relevant to my next research topic, which became the book 1774. I decided to take advantage of being there to explore some of those sources. Later on, I returned for an additional month of research, but that's another story. So how, you might ask, did I know in 2009 that my next project would be a narrative history of the events of the year 1774? That's the tale I'm starting with today because it goes back to the very beginning of my graduate career as a historian, in fact, to my graduate study at Harvard in the mid to late 1960s. At the suggestion of my mentor, Bernard Bailyn, I decided to focus my dissertation on the Loyalists of the Revolution. I've explained how that happened several times. I won't repeat it here unless somebody asks in the question period. But I have to say that has really influenced my career ever since, the fact that I chose to write about Loyalists first. I then chose to study the Loyalist exiles who moved to Great Britain during the war for my dissertation. That required me to live in London for an extended period, which I must admit was my plan all along, because I'd fallen in love with London on my first visit as a tourist, and I said, I am going to pick a dissertation topic that requires me to live in London, which I did very successfully. So while doing that research on the Loyalists, I realized for the first time how important the events of 1774 were for dividing the American populace. Studies of Loyalists and revolutionaries have often identified those divisions as starting with the Stamp Act crisis of 1765 or even earlier. But reading about the Americans who identified as Loyalists and went into exile voluntarily or involuntarily convinced me that earlier political disagreements over imperial policy did not necessarily map onto later divisions between Loyalists and patriots. That is, some leaders of resistance in the 1770s were among those who ended up remaining loyal to the crown, and some initial supporters of royal authority were alienated by Britain's responses to Americans' actions. So I concluded that almost all the colonists, with few, if any, exceptions, could be described as loyal Britons as late as the beginning of the year 1774. But by the end of that year, circumstances had changed dramatically. And so for my dissertation and first book, I spent hours crafting an initial sentence. And I think it took me a morning. I think it took an entire morning to write the sentence I'm about to read to you, because I use it as an epigraph in this new book, 1774. Here's the sentence that took me so long to write. Quote, "The year 1774 dawned 16 days after the Boston Tea Party, and by the time its 12 months ended, the royal provincial governments were in disarray. The First Continental Congress had convened and adjourned, and the battles of Lexington and Concord were just 3.5 months in the future." That's what to me, writing in the 1960s and to this day, the summary that succinctly describes the significant changes that occurred during the crucial year that I wrote this particular book about. Yet, as it happens, scholars examining the origins of the revolution did not in the 1960s pay detailed attention to the events of 1774. And for the most part, with very few exceptions other than my own work, they still have not done that. It's still, the events of 1774 still have not drawn the scrutiny that I think they need from scholars. Now, in my recent book, I stretched the time period to include the 16 months between October 1773, when the colonies learned that ships carrying East India Company tea would be arriving on their shores, and the outbreak of fighting in April 1775. Thus, in the book's title, I dubbed 1774 the long year of revolution. Academics in the audience will recognize the trope of scholars who refer to the long 18th century and mean the years 1688 to 1815. I deliberately built on that with my own phrase. Now, unsurprisingly, given the insights I'd gained from my dissertation research into what happened in 1774, when I completed my work on the Loyalist exiles, I planned to study the events of that year more closely. At that time, I was teaching at the University of Connecticut, and in those pre-internet days, I hired a graduate student assistant to start scouting research sources for me. Then after 2 years at UConn, I moved to Cornell, and that move changed my scholarly trajectory. First, I became involved with a group of female faculty members from fields like literature, sociology, and psychology who were trying to set up a women's studies program. They introduced me to the beginnings of feminist scholarship in their disciplines. Second, a few early articles on American women's history began to appear in the journals I led regularly, all focused on the 19th century. The authors tended to make assumptions about women's lives in the preceding century that I thought were erroneous, even though I had never explicitly studied women. But I had read correspondence from and to women who were related to the male loyalists who had been my primary interest, and I had also read and taken notes on claims from widows submitted to the Loyalist Claims Commission in Great Britain after the war. So I decided, this is 1971, I decided to write an article about American women in the 18th century. In 1980, it was a book. Within a few months, it became very clear that an article was not going to do it. Liberty's Daughters, mentioned in the introduction of this talk today, was published in 1980, and it's still in print. And more importantly, for this origin story, it led me to subsequent decades of work on women and gender in the 17th century, far away from my initial research plans. And that ultimately led me to a study of, as you've already heard, the Salem witchcraft crisis of 1692, which became the key predecessor for my return to my long-time interest in 1774. Now, that observation might seem peculiar or even outlandish. How could a book on witchcraft in 1692 affect one on the run-up to the American Revolution in 1774? The answer lies in how both books are organized and the scholarly approach that I take in them. When I first proposed a book on the Salem trials, I planned a series of topical chapters. I still have a copy of my initial proposal, and it's very different from the book I ended up writing. That's because I realized while taking notes from legal records that I needed a clear understanding of the chronology of the crisis, which was hard to discern from the records and from previous books, which had all been organized topically. So I created a detailed calendar of events for 1692 on my laptop. I had a different page for every week. Now, unbeknownst to me, Marilyn Broach was at the time preparing a day-to-day summary of the Salem crisis. Her book appeared in print about the same time as mine did. And then our books were both followed in 2010 by the definitive edition of the legal records. If only those books had been in existence in the late 1990s while I was doing my initial research, my task would have been a great deal easier. But the chronology that I created as a tool for understanding the dynamics of 1692 ended up being the crucial element in the book. In the Devil's Snare has two key characteristics that differentiate it from other books about the crisis that preceded it and most that have followed it. First, it was largely chronological and primarily narrative in focus. And second, it presented the events of 1692, 1693 entirely as contemporaries viewed them. I deliberately described the developments in the crisis in terms used by the participants. I eschewed offering my own interpretation until the very end of the book. So, having successfully composed a narrative of the Salem crisis, organized chronologically, and recognizing what I had gained from doing that, when I returned to my old idea of writing about 1774, I did so aiming from the outset to create a similar narrative. I completely changed the conception of the book that I had left undeveloped for many years, which had focused on individuals, on biographies, for example, rather than on the overarching chronology. Because of my prior work on the Loyalists, I, of course, wanted to give them more attention than other narratives of the period did. That also meant paying attention to political moderates, not just to the radical leaders like Samuel Adams, who have traditionally been the focal point of discussions of the period. So for 1774, I adopted the same strategy I did with the Salem book. That is, I stuck with the developments at the time in North America, rather than providing a comprehensive narrative informed by subsequent historical scholarship. One of the crucial consequences of that decision is the fact that the people in my narrative in 1774 only know what is going on in England when someone writes to tell them about it or when they read a newspaper account. So each chapter has a short section in it and an appropriate point entitled Advices from London, which gave information about what was happening in Britain. So it was just, I did not adopt the strategy of many historians of being the all-knowing narrator who explained everything that was happening other places that the people you were writing about didn't know about. I wanted to keep in their context. For example, every other book that has described the destruction of the tea in Boston, by the way, it was never called the Boston Tea Party contemporaneously. It was only called that starting in the early 19th century. And so at the time, everybody else called it the destruction of the tea. So that's how I refer to it. Every other book that has discussed the destruction of the tea in Boston switches its narrative attention to Parliament and the King after describing that event. Readers of those books learn details about parliamentary debates, the actions of the ministry, and the King's reactions to America in several chapters before the authors move their narrative focus back to the colony. Some of you may be familiar with Nick Bunker's very good book, The Edge of Empire. And he does that. He talks about the destruction of the tea in Boston. Then the narrative switches to London, very detailed accounts of parliamentary debates, and then it comes back to North America again. I don't do that. I don't discuss debates in London in any detail, then or later, except through correspondence from Americans there, like Benjamin Franklin or Arthur Lee. Instead, I keep my eyes firmly fixed on Americans' reactions to the tea destruction, a subject that no other author has addressed, to my knowledge. In the end, I therefore learned an important lesson from the first chronologically organized book I wrote, In the Devil's Snare, and I applied that lesson to 1774, the long year of revolution. Developing the same sort of chronology for the recent book reaped rewards, leading me to several revelatory findings. I now want to turn to what 3 of those were and to what I gained by paying close attention to dates, which are, after all, a historian's key stock in trade, or they're supposed to be, let's put it that way. So I really wanted to pay a lot of attention to when everything happened, very precisely. So I started by figuring out when and how Americans first learned that ships carrying tea directly from the East India Company were being dispatched to the colonies, sent to especially designated agents who would then distribute the tea to individual merchants. That news came in a personal letter sent from London in May 1773 to a Philadelphian. It was initially published in a local newspaper in Philadelphia in mid-August. Note, the date of the letter is mid-May, but nobody knows anything about it in America until it's published in a Philadelphia newspaper in mid-August. And oftentimes, correspondence from some interesting correspondence, then excerpts from it get published in American newspapers. You look at newspapers at this time, you'll see that. And it's pretty standard. In fact, this is why printers liked to also run post offices. That's what Benjamin Franklin did. He was the postmaster and he was a printer. And so someone would come in to pick up their mail. They would read a letter from London. They say, "Oh, really interesting information," and then that would get excerpted in the newspaper as a crucial piece of, shall we say, breaking news. But anyway, that letter that was published in mid-August, or the extract from it, was reprinted in newspapers throughout the colonies over the next month. It got carried from newspaper to newspaper because the printers all exchanged copies and they all ran things that other papers ran. The news it contained was incomplete and partly inaccurate because the letter identified Boston as the only port to which the tea was being sent. But the East India Company also had targeted Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston for shipments. More specific information then trickled slowly in over the next 2 months in other reprinted letters and newspaper accounts from London, which I do report in the book. The first colonists who penned protests about the East India Company's plans published their essays in mid-October in New York and Philadelphia, not in Boston. This is sort of surprising to us. What was really surprising to me was that Samuel Adams and the Boston Committee of Correspondence were, in retrospect, remarkably unconcerned early on about the news of the ship's impending arrival. They kind of did nothing. That changed when opposition essays from Philadelphia were reprinted in the Boston papers. One by the young physician Benjamin Rush, who later, of course, became a leading revolutionary, seems to have had a significant impact on Bostonians. Rush argued that the East India Company tea should not be allowed to land. Other writers who were opposing the tea proposed different means of resistance, such as forcing the resignation of the tea agents or possibly having a boycott of the tea once it had landed. But Rush said, no, we can't let the tea land. And Bostonians began to act against the tea in early November. So 2 or 3 weeks after New Yorkers and Philadelphians had begun to act against the tea, the Bostonians began to publicly demonstrate against the local tea agents. But of course, nothing could happen until the ships arrived. So a waiting game began in all 4 cities. They all knew tea ships were coming, but they didn't know when they would arrive. Now, although I had lectured about the destruction of the tea and calling it, of course, the Boston Tea Party, the destruction of the tea for years in my course on the American Revolution, I had no idea that a tea ship arrived in Charleston on December 2nd, just 4 days after the first ship landed in Boston. I'll repeat that. A tea ship, the sole tea ship going to Charleston, arrived on December 2nd, just 4 days after the first of 3 ships landed in Boston. They said 3 ships made it to Boston, a 4th wrecked on Cape Cod in a massive winter storm. I'll say some more about that shipwreck in a bit. Now, my ignorance of the coincidental timing of the ship's arrivals resulted from previous historians having paid no attention to dates or even to South Carolina in their intense focus on the dramatic events further north. If other books mention Charleston at all, it was always as a brief discussion after the confrontation in Boston was considered, with no attention to when anything happened. So I had long assumed that the Charleston events followed the Boston ones. But to me, as I was working on this book, the conjunction of dates became key to my analysis and to the organization of the first chapter of the book. Because if you read it, you'll see I move the narrative back and forth between the 2 cities. The residents of neither city knew much about what was going on in the other one, although in the next few weeks, captains of vessels sailing along the coast did convey some news of meetings they had witnessed, along with copies of local newspapers. But the contrast between what happened in Boston and in Charleston allowed me to show that Americans' opposition to East India Company tea varied considerably from place to place. The destruction of the tea in Boston became one example of several, rather than the only iconic episode. And those differences made it possible to sharpen my analyses and to focus on the key contrasts. So in both ports, reactions to the tea began with mass meetings of residents, but there the similarities ended. Bostonians voted not to let the tea land, and crucially, and I underscore crucially, recruited volunteers to maintain a 24-hour guard on the wharf to ensure it was not offloaded clandestinely. In Charleston, some men argued for preventing the tea from landing, just as they did in Boston, but others supported the East India Company's right to sell it, or preferred instead convincing merchants to join a boycott once it was landed. The participants did force the tea agents to resign in Charleston, and they sought to pressure the captain to return to England with his cargo. But they didn't set a guard on the wharf. And furthermore, they disagreed about the outcome of their meeting. There are newspaper accounts that indicate that people in Charleston were confused, and they couldn't even reach a consensus about what exactly they had decided in their meeting. Clearly, nobody was taking notes. Other than asking the captain to return to England without unloading the tea. So they had to convene additional meetings. And so in the Charleston newspapers, you get reports of other meetings. Alas, you hear nothing about what was said in them. Just there was a meeting here, there was a meeting there, it was a meeting of this group, there was a meeting of that group. And then when they happened, but not what was said at them. So I have no idea. It's too bad. Nobody took notes there either. Now, a second aspect of the port's experiences was the same. Both faced a deadline to resolve the issue raised by the tea's presence. Because the ships formally registered their cargoes at the customs houses, that triggered a 20-day time limit in the customs laws. Tax had to be paid on the tea within that period, or customs officers would confiscate it. That was the reason that Bostonians in disguise destroyed the tea on the night of December 16th, because the next day they would have had to confront officers from the Customs Service and possibly soldiers if they wanted to prevent the tea from landing, because that would have been the end of the 20-day limit in Boston. In Charleston, the deadline was 4 days later, and the disagreement over what to do about the tea persisted there. So what happened was, they couldn't make up their mind. That is, the local people couldn't make up their mind. And so guess what? The Charleston customs officers confiscated the tea for non-payment of the duty. They reported to the East India Company that they did so without, quote, the least disturbance, end quote. The Carolina gentlemen, that's how they described them, had simply watched them unload the tea chests, which were then stored in the Exchange building near the harbor. You can actually visit the Exchange if you go to Charleston today. It's still there. And the tea that was confiscated was sold much later by the Americans to support the war effort. Now, because of the difficulties that beset the Bostonians and South Carolinians after the tea ships formally entered the harbors, the ports to which the ships came later dealt very differently with the vessels. Significantly, Philadelphians knew about the events in Boston before its tea ship arrived. The Boston Committee had, in fact, very quickly dispatched their messenger, Paul Revere, to Philadelphia to report what had happened. Now, information from Charleston was incomplete and garbled, and that took somewhat longer to arrive anywhere in Philadelphia or Boston or New York. So what the Philadelphians did was they called on the Delaware River pilots not to cooperate with the tea ship that was headed there. And they published a broadside, it's an illustration in the book, describing the ship and its captain. They said he was fat, and therefore people should look out for him. And so the committee, knowing what the ship was coming, what the captain looked like, they intercepted the ship in late December before it arrived in Philadelphia. And they soon, and I say persuaded, the captain that it would be in his best interest to turn the ship around and sail back to England. Obviously frightened, he acquiesced. The ship bound for New York was blown to the Caribbean by the same gale that wrecked the 4th Boston ship on the Cape, so it spent the winter in Antigua. That captain, learning accurately what had happened in both Boston and Charleston, wrote ahead to New Yorkers in the late winter to tell them, I've been in Antigua for the winter. I have to come. I'm going to come to New Jersey to resupply my vessel, but I'll do nothing else before returning to London. And that's what he did in April 1774. And I have to say, I love that there's a description in one of the New York papers of all the members of the New York Committee standing on the wharf, waving goodbye to the tea ship who never went into New York, saying, oh, have a wonderful voyage. You're a great guy. They talk about what a good guy this captain is. I love this image of these guys saying, yeah, bye, have a good ship. Now, I found studying the shipwreck on the Cape, which other books barely mentioned, if at all, and its aftermath especially enlightening. Most of the tea on the vessel was salvaged and sent to the British Army in Boston. A man named James Fichter, who's a very fine historian of the British Empire, has written about its fate in his new book, which is called simply Tea. It's published by the Cornell University Press. But some of the tea remained on the Cape. So most of it went to the British Army in Boston, but some remained on the Cape. Part was divided among the workers who unloaded the cargo from the wreck. It's not clear how much the individual workers ended up with, though, because most of them were blamed for cooperating with the importers and the East India Company tea, and many of them seem to have lost their share to mobs. Another tea chest was split between 2 local elite men, the Justice of the Peace and the militia colonel, both of whom offered it for sale in their stores. Some Cape residents bought it, which led to vehement arguments. A town meeting formally voted that the sales were acceptable because, after all, the tea hadn't paid any tax. It had been wrecked. It hadn't paid any tax, so they argued that people could buy it without breaking any boycotts or anything like that. Another town meeting reversed that decision, though, and both men were publicly censured. So there were competing town meetings on the Cape, actually in Wellfleet. Now, the chaos on the Cape lasted for months and included a dramatic moment when the militiamen mustered for an unsuccessful attack on their own colonel. The mobbings and arguments persisted into early summer 1774, which showed me what could have happened had the tea been landed elsewhere. Accordingly, it revealed the wisdom of the tactic that Rush had suggested months earlier, that is, preventing the tea from landing, which had ultimately been adopted by Samuel Adams and the Boston Committee. Now, Americans' understanding of the tea controversy to this day erroneously sees Boston's action as emblematic of the colonists' response to East India Company tea. But let me pose a counterfactual question. What would it mean if Americans today recognized that colonists' reactions to EIC tea shipments in 1773 created widespread and long-lasting political controversies rather than unanimity? Our sense is everybody in Boston wanted to throw the tea in the harbor. Everybody in America wanted to throw the tea in the harbor. Nope, not true. So what would happen if Americans today understood that this was not a widely celebrated event, but it was one that aroused great controversies? What if historians had not emphasized Bostonians' actions while ignoring or downplaying others? Now, another aspect of my analysis in the book is also relevant here, and it's directly related to chronology. During the Watergate affair in the mid-1970s, because we've just been passing an anniversary of that too, the Congressional Committee investigating Richard Nixon famously asked a critical question about his involvement in the break-in in the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate complex. What did the president know, and when did he know it? I think anybody who lived through the 70s knows that question. Now, I have modified that question and applied it to the history of the tea controversy in 1773 and to the revolution as a whole. What did the colonists know, and when did they know it? The thrust of my narrative is therefore not simply reconstructing the sequence of events, but also identifying when the Americans learned of certain events and how they responded to that knowledge. And I should say that friends of mine who've read the book have said to me that that to them is one of the most interesting parts of the book, realizing that when things happened, other people didn't know they had happened, and it took them a long time to figure it out. And so therefore, the consequences took a long time to develop. We're also familiar today with instant information about events far from our localities. It's hard to imagine sometimes how long it took in the 18th century for accurate news to travel in America or across the Atlantic. So my second example from the book has to do precisely with this delayed sharing of information, in this case, across the Atlantic and not up and down the coast. Let me just have another drink. So the emphasis on when the colonists learned key information turned out to be important to my interpretation of the coercive acts, the laws passed by Parliament to punish Massachusetts and Boston. The first, the Boston Port Act, closed the port to traffic by sea until the tea was paid for. News of that act, which was adopted in January 1774, arrived in mid-May 1774 with an effective date of June 1st. Thus, the colony had just 2 weeks to adapt to this act, leading to a mad scramble, especially by the authorities who, for example, because the Boston port was now going to be closed, that meant that Salem would become the main port. So all the customs officers had to move all their infrastructure from Boston to Salem, which I didn't think anybody had ever written about before, but it was very interesting to see the correspondence that they had about what they were doing. So the second act was the Massachusetts Government Act, which altered the colony's charter in major ways. It and the third act, the Administration of Justice Act, which I'll talk a bit about in a minute, were proposed in mid-April and approved by the king in late May. The Administration of Justice Act basically said that a British officer, a military officer, or an official of the government who killed a colonist could be tried in England, not in the colonies. The effective implication of that was, for example, if it had been in effect at the time of the Boston Massacre, the soldiers would not have been tried in Boston. They would have been tried in London. Okay, so that's that act. Now, the contents of these laws were disclosed in rumors as early as late June, but official copies did not arrive in the colonies until August 6th. People, by the way, were very wary of rumors at this time. Maybe people today should be warier of rumors, given what's been going on the internet lately about Haitian migrants in Ohio. In any event, people were very wary about rumors. And so nobody did anything, or nobody wanted to do anything until the official word of the content of the laws arrived on the 6th of August. Now, I actually ended up discussing this whole matter of these dates with my mentor, Bernard Balin, who alas has now died, but was alive when I was working on this book, and I had actually shared parts of it with him and got some very interesting feedback. But here's one of the most interesting pieces of feedback I got. He didn't even know that the colonists did not react to all the laws at the same time. He didn't know the difference in the dates, and this is an expert in the history of the American Revolution. Historians have always considered them as a unit, and historians have always listed the Quartering Act as one of them, but no, I didn't see anybody at the time responding to the Quartering Act. Nobody ever talked about it. So I don't know what the colonists in 1774 thought about the Quartering Act. Historians subsequently have said it's important part of the coercive acts. I don't know. So the differences in timing, the dates when the laws were enacted, coupled with the dates when their contents became accurately known in the colonies, turned out to be key to understanding the reactions to them. The Port Act took effect just 2 weeks after it arrived, and everyone had to respond to it quickly. The Massachusetts Government Act was implemented immediately in mid-August after Governor/General Thomas Gage made the charter changes it provided, including appointing new members of the Governor's Council, which proved to be a particular flashpoint throughout Massachusetts. The Administration of Justice Act portended a menacing future rather than the immediate threat of the other two. And I think that was really important. The colonists tellingly called it the Murder Act. When I saw that in the documents, I couldn't believe it. They started talking about it as the Murder Act. And I thought, wow. So although I found that some colonists defended the Boston Port Act and some colonists defended the Massachusetts Government Act, and if people want to know how and why, I will tell you in answers to questions, I located no one who defended the Administration of Justice Act, not even in the most conservative colony, Georgia, which refused to send delegates to the Continental Congress. Not even in Georgia was there anyone who was willing to publish a defense of the Administration of Justice Act, nor did I find any personal letter that said it was a good idea. Even future loyalists called it the Murder Act. So I conclude that opposition to the Murder Act in August 1774 and thereafter was an important part of the rising sentiment for resistance to Great Britain. And this leads me to my third example of the importance of chronology. I arranged my notes from disparate sources chronologically. The most notable and unexpected revelation that caused for me involved a series of events in New England in December 1774 that were reported in newspapers, private correspondence, and official reports. And I had taken notes on all those things and I filed them all chronologically. And not until I looked at them all together did I realize how they were linked. It turned out that the story started earlier. In mid-October, in interoffice communications I found at the British National Archives at Kew. The letters I read came from the British ambassador to The Hague to a Secretary of State in London, reporting on American vessels that had come to Amsterdam seeking to buy arms and ammunition. Note that timing, mid to late October 1774. Now, the Continental Congress was then winding down in Philadelphia, but for colonial ships to have reached the Netherlands by mid-October 1774, they would have had to leave North America in August or early September. The Continental Congress didn't even convene until the 5th of September. These vessels that were turning up in Amsterdam looking for guns and ammo had left before the Continental Congress met, or just when it was barely starting. In any event, they left before the Congress had issued any statements or adopted any policies. And this confirmed my tentative sense gained from my reading of these documents that a turning point in support of resistance was reached by the end of the summer, maybe even before the Continental Congress issued any of its statements. I don't really have anybody who says that, but that's what I concluded just by seeing what was happening. Again, with the deeply negative reaction to the Murder Act. Now, the ministry called the reports from The Hague to the attention of George III. On October 19th, the king issued an order in council forbidding the exportation of any arms and ammunition from Great Britain to the colonies for 6 months. Of course, he couldn't order arms and ammunition not to be exported from the Netherlands, but he could order it not to be exported from Britain. Lord Dartmouth, the Secretary of State for America, drafted an accompanying directive to governors ordering them to impound any military supplies that colonists attempted to import from anywhere. And Dartmouth instructed the ambassador to The Hague to try to interdict any arms shipments from there to the colonies. And actually, I have an account in the chapter about the attempts of the minister to try to prevent the arms shipments. Now, on the 8th of December, the news of October 19th Order in Council arrived in Rhode Island, where the General Assembly was currently in session. All hell broke loose. 3 attacks on forts in New England followed in quick succession. I had not linked them in my thinking until I realized that the attacks were all connected and all instigated by the arrival of the news of the King's Order in Council. So remember, the King sends this Order in Council on the 19th of October. Information about it arrives in Rhode Island on the 8th of December. So anticipating that the King's Order would lead Gage from Boston to send a man of war to Newport to seize cannon housed at the fort there, the Rhode Island Assembly moved swiftly on the very day the news from London arrived in their colony. Before nightfall on December 8th, I mean, it's amazing when you think of how quickly they moved. Before nightfall, on the day they got this information, they ordered local vessels and sailors to take charge of the guns in Newport. Volunteers worked steadily through that and the next night and eventually carried off 44 cannon to Providence. On December 10th, 2 days later, the Providence Gazette published the King's Order and Dartmouth's directive, so the information began to spread beyond New England to New York and further south, where there were further confrontations that I don't really have time to detail here, but there was especially an important one in New York, which you can read about in the book. On the next day, the 11th, the Rose man of war sailed into Newport Harbor from New London, Connecticut, and discovered that the fort had been stripped of its cannon. Was this in response to orders from Gage? I don't know. If it was, they don't survive. The timing would have been very tight, or it could have been a coincidence, but maybe it's really a coincidence. The Rose's captain upbraided Rhode Island's popularly elected governor for the loss. The governor replied, the captain recorded, quote, that they had done it to prevent the cannon from falling into the hands of the king, and they mean to make use of them to defend themselves. So this was a popular elected governor in Rhode Island. Rhode Island, Connecticut both had popularly elected governors. They're the only colonies that did. Now, with the Rose absent in Newport, hey, there was nobody guarding the fort in New London. So the residents of New London then moved to take over cannon from batteries at their harbor. And on the December 14th, they transported most of the cannon inland and stored the armaments there in 3 widely scattered locations. But already by then, on the 13th, Paul Revere had brought the news of what had happened in Newport to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Unlike Rhode Island and Connecticut, New Hampshire had a royal governor, John Wentworth. Nervous about the Newport events, he addressed the militiamen who were stationed at Fort William and Mary, warning them to be prepared for an attack. Rumors swirled, as they had in Newport, that General Gage would send troops to confiscate the arms. On the 14th, local committee members in Portsmouth gathered 300 to 400 men and overran the fort and its 6 defenders, holding them prisoner while they carried away about 100 barrels of gunpowder. Even more men gathered the next day to carry away 16 cannon and about 60 muskets. That day, the 15th, a sergeant, this is another one of my favorite scenes that's described in the correspondence. A sergeant went out to parade through the streets, beat a drum on the corners, and make public calls for the militia to muster to defend the fort, but nobody heeded the summons to arms because, of course, the militiamen were the men who would attack the fort. They were not going to defend it. Finally, help arrived from General Gage at Boston, and the raids on the fort's armaments necessarily ceased. But Wentworth told Dartmouth that he couldn't arrest and punish the guilty parties because no local officers would arrest them and no local jury would convict them. So colonists everywhere recognized the significance of these attacks on the New England forts. They did not universally approve. Far from it. Many were concerned about the reported violence. Some feared that the attacks would stimulate imitators elsewhere, and others that they would lead to further retaliation from London. But events were moving so rapidly, but by the time the authorities in London had time to react to information about these attacks in early December, war was already upon them. That was brought on by the January 1775 order from Lord Dartmouth to General Gage that crossed the Atlantic in the opposite direction, approximately simultaneously with Winthrop's account. Wentworth is writing this way, Dartmouth is writing this way, and Gage, as everybody knows, responded to that January order by ordering troops to move on Concord on April 19th, 1775, which is the end of my book. So we might conclude from these three episodes that timing was everything. It governed the events themselves in the 18th century, for when things happened had a lot to do with how and why they happened. Just think of the different reactions to the East India Company tea and how important dates were in that story. From the nearly simultaneous incidents in Boston and Charleston, the Cape Cod shipwreck, the impact of the 20-day rule and the customs statutes, and the crucial significance of Philadelphia and New York, knowing what had happened in Boston before their tea ships arrived so they could recalibrate their responses. Delays in when the colonists learned about events in London, in particular passage of the various coercive acts and the King's October Quarter in Council, largely determined their reactions to those events. And finally, of course, timing helped me to create my interpretations as a historian, especially because I decided from the outset, again, because of my experience in writing the book about Salem, to prioritize contemporary knowledge of my topics rather than the subsequent interpretations by historians. So I call that a proper historical ending. And with that, I'll end the talk and open it up to questions. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. That was a lot of years of research pouring out to us, and we're so grateful. Thank you so much. We're going to take questions from the live audience as well as from our audience on Zoom. So would anyone like to start us off?
Of the ships that went to the Hague.
Can you speak it up?
Sorry,
Speak up.
the ships that went to the Hague.
Yes.
Who directed them? Who sent them?
We have no idea because the information comes from The Hague and they didn't know who were the owners. I mean, they were Americans. They knew that, but they didn't know who the owners were. So we don't know. There are indications in some records of the ownership of ships that went, I didn't mention this, but ships also went to modern Germany. Of course, it wasn't Germany at the time, but they went to Hamburg, they went to Sweden, they went to Spain in search of guns and ammunition. I just mentioned those briefly because I didn't have really good information about them. I have the best information about The Hague, the incidents in The Hague. But it's really interesting. The British send a Coast Guard cutter to try to prevent a particular ship from leaving for leaving the harbor around Amsterdam. And basically they play cat and mouse with the ship from America in the waters around Amsterdam for months. And then it seems they've stopped it, but guess what? The guy unloaded his cargo, put it on another ship, and it seems to have gone off to the Caribbean, to the Dutch colonies in the Caribbean, which was the real danger that they were afraid about, because they could legally get out of the Netherlands as long as they said they were going to St. Eustatius. And I talk about the importance of St. Eustatius, or Statia as we know it today, as a smuggling entrepot for weapons into the American colonies. Sorry.
Do you have any guesses?
No, I have no idea. I'm not an expert on the armament dealers in North America. There are some people who've done that. I know people who were researching that. And I know there's stuff at the New England Historic Genealogical Society that they've found in some records there about some Bostonians who were among the dealers, but I don't know. Would be nice to know. There's many things that would be nice to know, but I don't know anything of that one. Yeah.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. You're very careful about dates, and I'm an accountant and I count.
Oh, good.
And I thought I heard you say that the
Charleston?
Charleston ship arrived 4 days prior to the Boston.
No, after.
After. Okay. So that then the 20-day tariff thing was 4 days later than.
Then later than in Boston.
Thank
That's
you.
right.
Thank you.
That's right. Yeah. Actually, they seem to have counted the days differently, as my copy editor pointed out to me when I did this, because she said it's actually 5 days after in Charleston. But they seem, I mean, it may have been that the ship captain in Charleston may have waited a day to register his cargo at the customs house, which is a fact I don't know. But in any event, yeah, my very careful copy editor on this book said, wait a minute, that's actually 5 days later in Charleston, not 4. But they all said it was the same. So I said, okay.
Thank you. I believe we have a question from our Zoom audience.
We do, yes. So we have a question regarding loyalists. So they asked, given your deep study of loyalists, do you know how common it was in New England or elsewhere for loyalists to stay here, living side by side with revolutionaries in the time leading up to and through the War for Independence, as happened in Hingham?
I never looked at the loyalists who stayed here. I only looked at the loyalists who left. There are other people who've worked on the loyalists who lived here. There have been there's some very interesting research that's been done on loyalists who stayed in the South, for example. But no, and there is some stuff on loyalists who stayed in New England, but that's not what I did. And I think there is a newish book, but I haven't read it. So what can I say? Yeah. Remember, everybody's a loyalist before 1774, pretty much. Yeah.
Down the road from here in Marshfield,
Yes.
there were quite a few loyalists.
Yes, that's right. And I wrote about them in the book and extensively. I found some of the records.
A
Yeah.
lot of them were banished by the Massachusetts Banishment Act.
Right.
Those who stayed and did their contrition pretty much were allowed to function as normal, although they certainly weren't allowed to join militia and take up arms.
Right.
It took a long time for that wound to heal, I understand, too.
Yeah, that's pretty common, a pretty common pattern. I didn't know that specifically about the Marshfield loyalists. I did find some wonderful records about the loyalists in Marshfield, which I talk about. But when I studied the loyalist exiles, one of the great ironies was that the people who were the most homesick and who desperately wanted to come home after the revolution and sort of come back into their hometowns were the ones who were treated the worst. People who didn't wait after the peace treaty was signed, but who rushed back to America were sometimes forced to leave again, or at least were treated very badly. Whereas people who were more circumspect and who wrote letters to their friends and family to say, how will I be treated if I come back? Those people were greeted with more friendship. So that I do know. How about New Brunswick? People went to New Brunswick, yes.
And when did that happen? When did that occur?
I'm sorry, what does what?
Well, there was a lot of people that went to New Brunswick.
Yes, right.
So when did that occur?
Oh, and that occurs after the revolution because in fact, New Brunswick, actually the Canadian historians got kind of mad at me because in my book on the Loyalists, I say that the whole province of New Brunswick was created to give jobs to people from the American colonies who were losing their positions as the governor or the lieutenant governor or the chief justice or whatever. So you needed a whole new bureaucracy of a colony to give them positions. And so I said that was the origin of New Brunswick. And there were people who didn't like that argument. The Canadians didn't like it, but I do think it's true. They had the Brits had a very, very hard time finding places for all the leaders of the American colonies who had left, who were loyalists. Yeah. Yeah.
In your research on the Boston Tea Party, did you come across?
How about the destruction of the tea?
Thank you. Did you come across the names of the people who were involved? I know that was.
I did not do that research. Other people have done it. And in fact, the NEHGS right now is doing a big project to try to identify everybody. But it's been done by Ben Karp in his book on the Boston Tea Party. He did the best he could several years ago to identify the participants, the people who actually participated, and then the people who later on claimed they had participated, which were many, or people who claimed their parents had contributed or their grandfathers had contributed or whatever. But the NEHGS has got a big project underway right now to try to identify all of them. But I have to say that I did not concern myself with the details of the destruction of the tea. The other people have done that. I felt that my role was to talk about the things other people hadn't talked about, like Charleston or New York or the Cape. I found the whole story of the shipwreck on the Cape to be absolutely fascinating. And I even went to see where the wreck had occurred, which is currently in Cape Cod National Seashore. And it was fascinating to realize that the sandbar that ship went aground on is still there, even though the configuration of the sand has really changed. But it was actually also the site of another famous shipwreck a few years later.
You mentioned in the book that you mentioned in your lecture that the tea confiscated from the shipwreck was returned to the British in Boston Harbor.
Yes.
Wasn't some taken by locals? And what do you say of?
Yeah, no, I said they were taken. There was tea taken by locals on the Cape. And the problem was that people who had it, when the guys who unloaded the ship before it was smashed to pieces in the storm, were paid in tea. And so they had tea. And then they were called up in front of the town meeting in Truro and made to apologize and to give up their tea. So did they still have it at the time that was done, or had they managed to, say, sell it to somebody else? And there's no way of knowing that. There is a story that I talk about in the book of a guy who had picked up a couple of pounds of tea in Provincetown, and he was heading home from Provincetown. Wherever home was is not clear, but he was accosted in what was described as the Wellfleet Woods by a mob that took the 2 pounds of tea that he had in his saddlebag and strewed it all over the ground. So there were people who had tea who were deprived of it. Oh, and I might say there is a Martha's Vineyard connection to this too. A peddler turned up on Martha's Vineyard with 100 pounds of tea, and everybody decided that he had gotten it from the wreck of the ship, from the wreck of the William. But nobody knows for sure that that's where it came from. He said he'd gotten it from smugglers in Rhode Island, which could have been true. So anyway,
Great. We have a couple more questions online, if you don't mind.
So we have a question that is, do you have thoughts on why the Boston response to the destruction of the tea became the prominent description and not the other responses?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the part of it.
Oh,
Finish the sentence.
So why did the response to what happened in Boston become the prominent description?
Oh, yeah.
And not other areas?
It's just more exciting to think of all these guys in disguise throwing tea overboard. Isn't that a lot more exciting than reading about a bunch of Charleston gentlemen standing around watching customs officers confiscate tea? I mean, what do you want to have the emblem of whatever, I think also a lot of it has to do with the celebration of the American Revolution later. I mean, it's like when it gets called the Boston Tea Party, which is, I think I'm remembering correctly, 1826. I mean, it's the 50th anniversary, basically, is when they start calling it the Boston Tea Party. A colleague of mine found it out, Larry Glickman, one of my colleagues at Cornell, who did a book on consumer boycotts. And so he started off with the boycott of tea, and he found the first statement it was, I think, a New York newspaper, and I think it was 1825, 1826, something like that, calling it the Boston Tea Party. I have it in a footnote.
Fantastic. Oh, in
There
the
was-
front row, let me just get to you, please, Anne. Thanks. Okay, this will be our last.
Rose had a question.
Yep.
In your research, did you come across a tea party in North Carolina that occurred a little bit before the Boston Tea Party where the women boycotted?
No, that was later.
That was later.
The New York, the North Carolina event that is called the Edenton Ladies Tea Party
Yeah.
is actually inaccurately named, and it happened later.
Okay.
And it had nothing to do with tea. It was a group of women from Edenton, North Carolina, who signed a statement supporting the revolution, basically, and supporting the government, the revolutionary government of North Carolina. And subsequent people said it was a tea party because it was women, it was demeaning because it was women. So yeah, but it was long after.
Okay, that clarifies a lot.
Yeah, right.
Thank you. Well, let's hear it from Mary Beth Norton and that fascinating. Our next lecture in the series is on Sunday, October 27th, with Rob Parkinson from SUNY Binghamton, who will speak on his book, Making 13 Clocks Strike as One. I vetted Professor Parkinson with Professor Norton last night, and
Yeah, he's a
Two
good
thumbs
guy.
up.
You'll enjoy hearing him.
you'll enjoy hearing him. So, and he's also, I believe, a Hanover native. So we welcome you back on October 27th. And with that, we'll say goodbye to our Zoom audience, and we welcome you all here in person to join us downstairs for light refreshments. And Professor Norton has generously offered 2 signed copies of 1774. So thank you so much for your very insightful lecture.
Thank you all.